It's impossible to reach a truly advanced level of English without living in an English-speaking country. What a load of codswallop. I've heard that so often over the years, and it's something that really frustrates and annoys me because it's a form of defeatism. You're basically admitting defeat before you've ever really tried. It's also a bit of an excuse. And also it's just not true. I've had many students over the years who have reached a C2 level and passed the C2 Proficiency Cambridge English exam, for example, without ever having even visited an English-speaking country, let alone lived there. And the opposite can also happen. It's possible to live in the country which speaks your target language, but never reach an advanced level. You're not guaranteed to learn the language just because you live in the country that speaks that language. It doesn't happen by osmosis. It's all about an attitude. However, having said that, of course there are many advantages to living in an English-speaking country if you want to learn English. But a lot of those advantages can be recreated or simulated without ever having to even set foot in an English-speaking country. But we have to be proactive, especially when it comes to learning and expanding our vocabulary. So in this video, I'm going to explain the 3 steps you need to take in order to really expand your vocabulary and reach that advanced level of English. Now, of course, one of the biggest advantages to living in an English-speaking country if you're trying to learn English is that you're just exposed to vocabulary all the time. Everywhere you go, everything you do, you find English vocabulary, of course, because you're in that country. So if you're not living in an English-speaking country, you need to find other ways of getting this input. And that's the first step. Where do you find the vocabulary? What are your sources of vocabulary? Now, of course, all good English teachers will encourage you to read books in English, read articles in English, watch films in English, listen to podcasts, do everything in English basically, in order to get that input. That's where it comes from, those materials, those sources. Now, we are really lucky because there has never been a better time in history to learn a language because it's so easy to get this input. You know, we have so many resources available to us now at the click of a mouse or at the touch of a button. Now, of course, it's not exactly the same as living in an English-speaking country where you're just naturally bombarded or surrounded by this vocabulary. But you can recreate it and simulate it if you are proactive and make the effort. Now, another thing that many English teachers will tell you is to read books, watch films, watch series, listen to podcasts that you find interesting, that you enjoy, right? Having said that, if you only read books or articles about things you find interesting, your vocabulary in that area is going to expand, but not in other areas. So if you love photography, for example, you can build your vocabulary in photography because you're motivated to read books and watch documentaries and just expose yourself to as much vocabulary about photography as possible. But if you need to speak about gardening one day, or maybe you're taking an English exam and there's a part where you need to write or speak about gardening, you're not going to have any idea because all your vocabulary is about photography. So occasionally, I'm not saying all the time, but occasionally you need to read things, maybe not books, but perhaps articles on areas which perhaps you wouldn't normally choose to read. Because that's the way you're really truly going to expand a wide range of vocabulary. You're not just going to expand a very limited area of vocabulary which you find interesting. But that brings me on to the second step you need to take. And that's related to the fact that you can't learn all the vocabulary in the English language, right? I don't know all the vocabulary in the English language, and I'm a native English speaker. You don't know all the vocabulary in your own language. So you have to learn to be selective. It's about selectivity. Now, this kind of contradicts my last point because, I'm suggesting you learn vocabulary from a wide range of sources. That's true. But you also have to understand that some vocabulary you learn, you will never use. Continuing my example with photography, if you're a budding photographer, the term chromatic aberration is probably useful and important to you. But if you're not interested in photography, if you don't plan to work in photography, you're probably never going to need to use it. So you shouldn't waste time and energy on vocabulary that is not going to be really useful to you. Now, of course, this happens naturally when you're living in a country which speaks your target language. You will be encountering vocabulary that is useful to you just because the fact that you encounter it regularly, that proves that it must be useful, right? So you need to really practice the vocabulary that you think or know is going to be more useful for you, maybe for your job, your studies, or even your social life. So you have your input, you've been reading a lot, you've been watching everything in English, listening to podcasts in English, etc. And you've been selective. You haven't just been trying to learn every word that you come across. You've been selecting the words that you feel will be more useful for you. Now it's time to use it, right? Use it or lose it. Again, when you're living in an English-speaking country, that will just be natural. Every day you will have to use the vocabulary you're learning, so it will be really reinforced in your brain. Just by going to the bank, going to the supermarket, going to a restaurant, meeting with friends, at work, maybe at university, you're just going to be exposed to the language, and then you're going to have opportunities to use it. So that's all about output, which is the third step we're looking at today. You need to use the vocabulary you're learning. If not, you will forget it. And I know many of you are now thinking, well, I don't have any opportunities to use my English. I don't have anybody to speak to in English. I'm never in a situation where I need to use English, so I can't do it. Well, that's not really true, is it? Again, that's a little bit of an excuse, because with the internet now, you can find people to interact with. Facebook groups or Instagram accounts, Discord channels, I'm not sure what they're called, to be honest, Telegram groups. You can find other people who are learning English, or maybe you don't need to find people who are learning English. You can just find, for example, a Facebook group on photography, to continue that example. And you can just chat about photography in that group, and then maybe you find another Facebook group on gardening, for example, and you chat about gardening in that group. If you are proactive, you can find opportunities. But another big tip for output is to write. Write more. I'm not talking about writing essays necessarily, or reports. If you are preparing for an exam, then you do need to be doing that, as I've said many times. But no, if you just want to practice the vocabulary you've learned in context, then write short stories, write in a journal, write about what you've done today or what you saw in a recent film. Summarize a chapter of a book, rewrite the plot in a different way, using your own words or using the words you have learned from the book, but without actually copying the text. Just try to remember and include the vocabulary. There are many ways to use English in a proactive way. But the output is extremely important. Without the output, it's very difficult to not only remember, but really understand how to use the vocabulary in context. So really the big question at the end of the day is, how serious are you about improving your English? Because it does take effort, and you do need to be proactive. Okay, let me know your own ideas for expanding your vocabulary in the comments, and I'll see you very soon for another video. Bye.